Well, I'm Whitney Lackenbauer. I'm a professor of history at St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo. So I want to give some reflections by an academic who spends a lot of time up north and deeply loves the Arctic, but is not a northerner. The far north is one of those realms that seems to fire up our imagination as Southern Canadians like none other. It's part of our national identity, particularly when we perceive that it's going to be taken away from us. Yet it's a place that the vast majority of us Canadians have never visited. It inspires us, yet it haunts us with its isolation, its historic inaccessibility, its frigid temperatures, and the possibility that it could be the key to Canada's future. So how does the North fit into Canada's national identity? It is, in several respects, central to our sense of scale on the world stage. We're the second largest country on Earth in size, and 40% of our land mass is in the territories, 3.7 million square kilometers. Without the territories, we'd drop to 6th place in the world. And how would that make us feel? We're the country with by far the world's longest coastline. In fact, our Arctic coastline alone is greater than the entire length of the coastline of any other country on this planet. In terms of our political identity, the federal government has intertwined the idea of sovereignty with strong rhetoric, asserting our status, Canada, as an Arctic superpower. And of course, we have the sense that it's our northernness that makes us different from the Americans. Our artists have evoked this northernness on canvas and music, film, and in words like Lawren Harris of the Group of Seven, who suggested in 1926, we're at the fringe of the Great North and its living whiteness, its loneliness and replenishment, its resignation and release, its call and answer, its cleansing rhythms. It seems that the top of the continent is a source of spiritual flow, providing Canadians with a more certain conviction of eternal values. And it's this seeming eternalness of the North, that reach of our country into the austerity of the Arctic, that makes our maps, mental and physical, so unique. And as artist Toni Onley wrote, for Canadians, the high Arctic is a zone of the mind and a large part of our consciousness. It is our identity. Without it, we would be in crisis. And even in the 21st century, with the vast majority of Canadians living in southern urban areas, where Canada Goose parkas are more of a status symbol than a necessity, except here in Winnipeg, of course, politicians turn to the North as a means to inspire us. The historic idea of the North as a resource frontier remains front and center, of course, stretching back to the days of the Klondike Gold Rush and Diefenbaker's swinging jowls proclaiming that northern vision, the pipeline debate of the 1970s, and it's taken on a whole new sense of urgency with global warming generating new images of open waters and access to resources long frozen in the Arctic's embrace. There's a sense of opportunity, calls to complete our nation building, to finally capitalize on the richness of our northern resources. Yet these frontier images are but one part of the Southern Canadian idea of North, as Justice Thomas Berger once imprinted in our minds, his landmark inquiry in the 1970s, reminding Southern Canadians of the most striking reality of all, that this resource frontier was and is, for Northern Indigenous peoples, a homeland. And this frontier-homeland dichotomy has been embedded in our national consciousness ever since. Southern Canadians tend to think of the North and the Arctic in particular as an Indigenous space. We marvel at Aboriginal people's adaptability, resiliency, and vibrant cultures. And our vision of an Indigenous Arctic is something that Canada has successfully exported abroad through the Arctic Council. And with the North assuming a greater prominence in Canadian political discourse over the last decade than ever before in our history, we are increasingly aware, as Berger put it back in 1976, that what happens in the North will be of great importance to the future of our country. It will tell us what kind of people we are. Or as Prime Minister Harper put it in 2012, upon the success of our activities here will depend in significant measure what kind of country Canada will be in the century to come. But using the North as a source of national inspiration also makes the Arctic a source of national anxiety. The way we imagine the Arctic makes it a focal point for our insecurities in a rapidly changing, uncertain world, forces us to face our failures, to live up to our responsibilities towards Indigenous Canadians, and to contemplate uncertainty in a world being reshaped by climate change. We get caught up in rhetoric of sovereignty, A noble idea, of course, reinforcing that the Arctic, or at least a significant slice of it, is ours. And many of us have heard the alarmist narratives about the Americans seeking to challenge our northern sovereignty, the Danes invading our precious Hans Island, potential battles with the Russians over the continental shelf up at the North Pole. This is about the Arctic, sure. But it's also an expression of our anxiety, even paranoia, about our inability as a nation to stand up to powerful neighbors and non-Arctic states eager now to participate in Arctic affairs. And too often as Canadians, we lose sight of this simple reality that we have established a very strong sovereignty position over the past century, that our ownership of the Arctic is long-standing, rooted in historic title, and most poignantly, in the use and ownership of our lands and waters by Aboriginal peoples since time immemorial. When we fixate on sovereignty as something we might lose, we actually lose sight of the critical priorities. The key sovereignty and security challenges that we face as a nation are not defense-related. They relate to human and environmental security. They're about access to food, lack of suitable housing, a right to be cold, and an inexcusable spate of deplorable social indicators that remind us of our shortcomings as a country in fulfilling our obligations to our fellow Canadians who live in the Arctic. I remember a few years ago returning home after an Operation Nanook exercise and hearing my friend Rob Hubert from the University of Calgary on the radio talking about Arctic sovereignty and security threats. And he was emphasizing uncertainty over boundaries and the possibility of international conflict, and I was struck by the irony of it all. I immediately thought back to my conversations just a few days before with Canadian Ranger Policy Ataguta on Bylot Island in Nunavut. And as we walked over the tundra, Paul told me stories and shared his thoughts on life in the North. And after walking for about half an hour, Paul sat and lit a cigarette. And when he was finished, he quietly laid back. And after a couple of minutes of wonderfully comfortable silence, he offered the simple words, "I'm home." And it was at that moment, perhaps more than any other, that I felt it. The connection to the land, his homeland, his identity. He had spent much of his childhood in camps along this stretch of coastline. It was as familiar and intimate to him as it was remote and exotic to me. I was a visitor passing through. He was a resident. This was home. And this message resonated at the core. As Southern Canadians, we still have a long way to go to internalize the Arctic as a here, not a there. And Policy and I, we have different identities, different backgrounds, different worries that stem from our northern and southern roots, but we share a common Canadianness. And as a fellow citizen, I want to see Canada live up to its possibilities for Paul. Thank you.